Well, good evening, and thanks for coming to this educational lecture series. It's a series of videos sponsored by the Humbug Film Group, and the whole theme throughout will be the grassroots effect. We're going to talk about burning rivers. Yes, rivers actually caught on fire at one time in the Great Lakes. We all know the Great Lakes and 1/5 the standing fresh water on the Earth's surface, and how many people came to settle here, and with that came industry, and 4 rivers, at least 4, caught on fire. On January 24th, 1968, it was a cold winter day, and a worker dropped an acetylene torch. 12,000 plus pounds of oil and grease were being discharged daily to the Buffalo River. It's a fairly small river. They had to close the river because of the fire. The fire was no big deal locally. It just got a couple of inches in a local newspaper of coverage. Back in 1968, the predecessor of U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration. They had this to say about the Buffalo River. The Buffalo River is a repulsive holding basin of industrial and municipal wastes. It is devoid of oxygen and almost sterile. Oils, phenols are present in large amounts. The Cuyahoga River, here on June 22nd, 1969, wooden debris soaked in oil caught on fire from sparks from a passing train over a railroad trestle. The flames climbed 5 stories high. It lasted about 30 minutes and caused $50,000 of damage. But that was not the only time that the Cuyahoga caught on fire. It caught on fire, believe it or not, 9 other times, including this spectacular fire of 1952, a 5-alarm fire that caused $1.5 million of damage. That would be over $17 million today in damage. The Rouge River in southeast Michigan, just a few miles upstream from us, later in 1969 on October 9th, sparks from an acetylene torch. Again, a worker dropped the torch and caught oil-soaked wooden debris and oil floating on the lower river on fire. Flames shot 50 feet into the air, and it took 10 pieces of fire department equipment and the John Kendall pictured here, which was the fireboat, Detroit fireboat at that time, to contain the fire. You don't put out a river fire, you contain it and let itself burn out. A couple days later, the Detroit Free Press said, when you have a river that burns, for crying out loud, you have troubles. It happened on Cleveland's Cuyahoga, and now it has happened on our Rouge River. The last one will be the Chicago River fires. We all think of Chicago and fire being the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. In this case, think of all the structures that were built of wood back then. Buildings, docks, ships. Then in 1888, oil waste on the river was ignited. They actually dropped a cigar to catch the river on fire. It became like a tourist attraction to see the fire roll across the Chicago River. These 4 burning rivers were perceived as working rivers that supported commerce and technological progress. All were dredged and channelized, and one even redirected, the Chicago River. River fires were perceived locally as just part of the cost of doing business. River fires document peak water pollution at that time and peak societal indifference to it. Equally important, though, are the grassroots efforts to revive these 4 burning rivers. Let me tell you a little bit about them, starting with the revival of the Buffalo River. Buffalo, New York was an early fur trading post. It then became the terminus of the Erie Canal in 1825. Think of all those people and all those goods that were moved across the Erie Canal to Buffalo, put on schooners and ships to help settle the West. This literally opened the interior of the continent and provided safe and reliable passage for vast numbers of people and goods. The Buffalo River was called the Queen City of the Lakes. It was an early shipbuilding port. It became the grain storage capital of the world and the leading miller of grains in the mid-1800s. At the peak of the maritime era of the 1800s, Buffalo was the fourth largest port in the world. There's a story that kind of tells this story in a really compelling way. It's about a gentleman named Stanley Speziak, who they later called Mr. Buffalo River. He was a jeweler in the heart of Buffalo, New York, but his passion was carrying about the Buffalo River and Lake Erie. In this picture in the middle, you'll see the President of the United States, President Johnson. On the right-hand side of your screen, Lady Bird. You see Nelson Rockefeller. You can imagine a jeweler from Buffalo, New York, getting these people to come to Buffalo, putting them on a tugboat, going out to the mouth of the Buffalo River, and then Stanley Speziak, who is the fourth person from the left with the horn-rimmed glasses, Stanley puts them on this tugboat, takes a galvanized pail that you see at the bottom, and dips it into the water of the Buffalo River, and pulls it up on a line and sets it on the deck, and he has a wooden spoon. He puts the wooden spoon in, picks it up, and oil goes drip, drip, drip. He turns to the President of the United States and says, "Mr. President, what is your policy about this?" And of course, he doesn't have an answer. He looks around, he looks for his handlers, and Stanley Speziak says, "Let me tell you what your policy is, Mr. President. You dredge this, and you put this into barges, you take it offshore, off the mouth of the Buffalo River, and you open the bottom of a barge, and you let it go into Lake Erie in the very same place where we draw our drinking water." He goes home, and with much urging from Lady Bird Johnson, and signs an executive order banning the open water disposal of contaminated sediments from dredging in the Great Lakes. The first one, incidentally, first confined disposal facility to take care of this was built on the Detroit River at Grassy Island. Again, an executive order. This had national significance in the United States. Speziak spoke out loudly and often about river pollution. Here he is with Bobby Kennedy on the Buffalo River. Now, looking back, people in Buffalo credit, and all of New York, credit him with starting the Industrial Pollution Control Program. So what has happened? They implemented this Buffalo River Improvement Corporation in 1967. This improved dissolved oxygen concentrations in the river. Back in the 1960s, it was always below 1 milligram per liter. That's very low. And after this, it was always at 5 milligrams per liter or more. They did lots of pollution prevention and control programs during the 70s and 80s. And then they had a remedial action plan that was started in 1985. And the Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper became the first nonprofit in the Great Lakes to coordinate and lead and facilitate the cleanup of the river. It was literally biologically dead in the 1960s, and substantial improvement of invertebrates has occurred. Also, there's been a return of the fishery. If you look on this slide, you'll see during the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, they were monitoring, they were surveying for fish in the river and could find no fish in the Buffalo River. No oxygen, no fish. Fish started coming back, and we have over 20 species of fish now in the river, and we also have peregrine falcons nesting in the skyscrapers of Buffalo, New York. Our next birding river story is on the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio. The Ohio and Erie Canal was opened in 1825 As a result of that, Cuyahoga became a major port, one of the leading wooden shipbuilding centers in all of the Great Lakes, and became known as Forest City. Cleveland became the inevitable meeting place for coal and iron ore, and literally an industrial powerhouse down in Cleveland's Flats. Standard Oil Company was started in 1889, and the rest is history from what Rockefeller did. There was more oil produced in Cleveland than any other place in North America. But as a result of that, Cleveland and the Cuyahoga became a flowing dump. Back in the early days, they tried to quantify just how much oil was being discharged into the Cuyahoga River. 17,600 tons of oil and grease, and 659,000 tons of oil-soaked contaminated sediment. There was a gentleman named Frank Sampsell. He had Sampsell Supply Company that's still in existence in Cleveland, Ohio, run by his family. And he saw all this oil floating on the Cuyahoga River, much of it coming from Standard Oil. And he said, that's an opportunity. So he bought a tugboat that you'll see here, and he put a holding tank on the bottom, and he put some pumps on it, and he would siphon off the top the oil from the Cuyahoga River, separate the oil from the water in the holding tank, and then sell it back to Standard Oil. And he called this ship the Putzfrau, which means cleaning lady in German. Another person from Cleveland was David Blauschild, who helped raise awareness. He took out ads in the Cleveland Plain Dealer that said, Lake Erie is dying and the pollution is coming from the Cuyahoga River. He was an automobile dealer, so he had money and resources to do that. And he first started with newspapers and then started putting up billboards coming into and going out of Cleveland that said, let's stop killing Lake Erie. Amazing the influence that an individual can make in grassroots efforts. During the 70s and 80s, there was lots of pollution prevention and control throughout the watershed. Again, this cleanup plan called the Remedial Action Plan was started in 1985, and Ohio EPA formed a group called the Cuyahoga River Comprehensive Planning Organization that put together, they were like a boundary organization working beyond political boundaries, institutional boundaries, disciplinary boundaries. And so what we've seen since that time is an improved benthic, invertebrates living in the bottom of the river communities since the 1960s, improved dissolved oxygen. Literally in the 1960s, there were no fish in the lower river. And today there are 70 species and a return of bald eagles, peregrine falcons, and osprey in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Our next story is the Rouge River in southeast Michigan and its revival. There is, as many of us know, heavy industry on the lower end and lots of urban development in the upper end, but that industrial development was led by Henry Ford, who consolidated automobile manufacturing operations, and this site became the largest integrated factory in the world at that time. During World War I, these ships called submarine chasers were built along the banks of the lower Rouge River. And of course, metropolitan Detroit, and the Rouge plant went on to become the heart of the arsenal of democracy. Ecologists and people who think about water like to talk about tipping points, that point in time where there is an urgent need to take action, and that if nothing is done, we could see irreversible harm to an ecosystem. Well, there were some big tipping points on the Rouge. Back in 1946 through 1948, they quantified just how much oil and petroleum products were being discharged to the Rouge and then Detroit River. Discharge is a nice way of saying dumped into the river. It turned out 5.9 million gallons of oil and petroleum products, or 694 tanker trucks were being discharged to the Rouge and Detroit rivers each year. If you think about that, it takes 1 gallon of oil to pollute 1 million gallons of water. That's enough oil not only to pollute the Detroit River, the waters of the Detroit River, but all of Western Lake Erie, all Michigan waters, all Ontario waters, all Ohio waters. In 1948, it was a very cold winter, unlike what we've been having in recent years here because of climate change. And much of the Detroit River would freeze over with ice, and there would only be a few pockets of open water there. And of course, the waterfowl came down on their migration and wanted to land in this open water that was filled with oil. And in 1948, 11,000 waterfowl died in one event. A group of duck hunters from Wyandotte and Grosse Ile and Trenton and Gibraltar picked up these oil-soaked carcasses of ducks and geese, threw them in their pickup trucks, and drove to Lansing, Michigan, the capital, started throwing them on the sidewalk, threw them on the front steps, called a press conference and said, "How dare you do this to the place we can't call home, the place where we're raising our families, the place where we recreate." They now, those duck hunters, are credited with starting the Industrial Pollution Control Program of Michigan. Another tipping point came sort of in the mid-1980s, and people just literally woke up one day to learn that combined sewer overflows and what was coming out of that was overwhelming the Rouge River. 168 combined sewer overflow points on the Rouge River. And when it rained, they would overflow, and it wasn't just storm water, but it was raw sewage. So literally, raw sewage and partially treated sewage was overwhelming the Rouge River. A man and his family were recreating on the banks of the Rouge River in 1985, and he slipped on the banks of the Rouge River, fell into the Rouge River. No big deal. In many places, the Rouge is shallow. He stood up. The water was about at his waist. He climbed out. He dried off a little. They finished their picnic, and he went home. That night, he started feeling sick. A couple days later, he died of leptospirosis, or rat fever. The health department said, well, we really can't prove that this one man's death was caused by the pollution, the raw sewage in the river, but the communities and people would have nothing to do with that thinking. They forced them, the health departments had to issue a health advisory saying no human contact with the Rouge River. All 48 communities had to come together through this remedial action plan to work together to clean up the Rouge River. Jim Murray was a Washtenaw County Drain Commissioner at the time. He had risen to the top of the chairman of the Michigan Water Resources Commission. He grew up in Canton. He took this on of bringing all these 48 communities, the 3 counties together, and to work together. Key organizations, Friends of the Rouge, today Alliance of Rouge Communities. Those were the ones who really brought this together. Under the leadership of the Alliance for Rouge Communities, it became, the Rouge watershed that is, became the first watershed in the United States to get a permit. In federal language, it's called a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit for stormwater. So it's the first watershed in the United States to have all 48 communities, all watershed communities, get this kind of a permit. In many respects, our good friend and champion, Congressman John Dingell, helped with that. He also brought in $350 million of federal funding, and that then in turn leveraged money from the 48 communities, from the 3 counties under this Rouge River National Wet Weather Demonstration Project. So what has happened? Again, pollution prevention and control dominated the 70s and 80s. Then in this tipping point in 1985. Since then, there's been combined sewer overflow and stormwater controls. Then this has eliminated these obnoxious odors. When there is no oxygen in the Rouge River, a gas would come out of the water with off gas called hydrogen sulfide. That's the smell of rotten eggs. You may have smelled that once in a while in certain places. So they've eliminated that. They've remediated Newburgh Lake sediments and removed some of the health advisories on certain species, certain size classes. We've seen some improvement in dissolved oxygen and elimination of the frequent fish kills that you saw in the earlier photo, even carp dying in the Rouge River. Some limited recovery of the invertebrates that live in the bottom and fishery, and a return of peregrine falcons at the mouth of the river. Our last story is about the Chicago River. In the early 1900s, waterborne disease epidemics were the problem in the Chicago River. The problem was they were discharging all the sewage to the very place that they were drawing their drinking water. And that's what happened. Can you imagine, as a result of that, a group of citizens got together in 1880, 140 years ago, and they established a citizen organization to address that problem because of these waterborne disease epidemics. In 1889, the Sanitary District of Chicago was formed to address the epidemics. This led to the construction of the Chicago Ship and Sanitary Canal that literally reversed the flow of the Chicago River. Instead of flowing into Lake Michigan, it flows now the other direction towards the Mississippi. Can you imagine the challenge of that at that time? You may have known back in early days of Chicago about slaughterhouses and meat processing plants. There was a creek called Bubbly Creek, and literally there was so much hog parts and other parts floating on the river that rats could run across the surface of Bubbly Creek. The reason it was called Bubbly Creek is that decomposition of waste, from pork and beef, all that was using up the oxygen, and then gases were off-gassing, bubbling up through Bubbly Creek. That was 1916. That was a picture from it. So what has happened? We've seen the elimination of waterborne disease epidemics in the early 1900s. Again, this reversal of the flow of the Chicago River. Between 1889 and 1910, we've had industrial municipal water pollution control, particularly during the 60s through the 80s, and improvement in dissolved oxygen concentrations since the 1960s. This improved dissolved oxygen and the quality of the river, particularly downstream of water reclamation plant outfalls, has really helped improve the fishery from 10 species in 1974 to 75 to today with over 70 species of fish. And of course, a return of peregrine falcons in the watershed. It must be remembered that Chicago River Ship and Sanitary Canal was constructed for navigation and water reclamation and not for habitat. A major concern, as we all probably know, is Asian carp coming into the Great Lakes and changing our food webs and depleting our economies. There is growing pressure now to hydrologically separate the Chicago Ship and Sanitary Canal from Lake Michigan to protect our fishery. In each of these stories, these four burning rivers, although much has been accomplished, much remains to be done to restore the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of these systems consistent with the Clean Water Act and the Canada-U.S. Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Remaining challenges for these rivers is preventing pollution. Contaminants still come in, can cause contaminated sediments, controlling the contaminants at their source, remediating contaminated sediments and brownfields, adequately controlling non-point source pollution, rehabilitating and conserving habitats and biodiversity, and of course, achieving sustainable development. I get asked a lot, what are the major accomplishments over the public outcry over pollution in the 1960s? That's a pretty easy answer. Think about it. The Clean Water Act of 1972 and the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, of 1970, considered the Magna Carta of environmental laws. The Endangered Species Act of 1973, the Canada-U.S. Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement of 1972, and of course, Earth Day. A little harder question is, what are the major accomplishments of the environmental movement today? Well, that is, in my opinion, the expansion and proliferation of non-governmental organizations working at the grassroots level to bring people together, to create a common vision, to co-produce knowledge, to co-innovate solutions, and lead us down a path to a more sustainable future. Critical elements of success, looking at these 4 burning river systems: local ownership of decision-making, well-recognized community champion. If you can have somebody like a John Dingle or a Stanley Spiesiak, that's really helpful to the process. We need cooperative learning. Nobody has all the answers to this, and we have to learn to work together. We need to use an ecosystem approach on a watershed scale, and we need to have a shared vision and objectives and complementary and reinforcing actions. We need cooperative planning that shares responsibility for delivery of programs. We need partnerships built on trust and respect. We need public involvement through organizations like Friends of the Detroit River, Friends of the Ruse, Friends of the Chicago River, Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper, Detroit Bird Alliance, International Wildlife Refuge Alliance, and more. Finally, we need coupling of research and monitoring with management. That always leads to better solutions in the end. We need government responsiveness, not top-down command and control management. We need to measure and celebrate progress in a very public fashion towards measurable endpoints. Simply put, if we don't change to more preventative and sustainable design, planning, and management of these watersheds and these communities, we will continue to react to tipping points and practice crisis management. The challenge is truly embrace sustainability, become more proactive, and avoid the next tipping point. We are pleased to have join us tonight Congresswoman Debbie Dingle with a message for all of us.
If you care about the air you breathe, if you care about the water that you drink, if you care about the ground your children play in, or the rivers and the lakes they swim in, then you need to become involved. You need to be engaged. You need to be the difference you want to make.
It is so important that we all come together to care for the place we call home, our ecosystem. We are part of an ecosystem. We are not separate from it. What we do to our ecosystem, we do to ourselves. Each of us, you and me, can make a positive change, not only in the environment, but in every aspect of our lives.
Hi, I'm Joanne with the Humbug Film Group. If you like what you see and would like to see more videos, you can help by making a donation with our friends at the Detroit River. You can go to their website at detroitriver.org or by calling 734-288-3889. Thank you so much.
Good.
Did you get the chicken clucking?
Yes.